Welcome everyone. Please go ahead and complete the poll. We'll leave it open for about 30 more seconds to answer those two questions before we get started, because we have a great packed agenda today and I want to make sure we get to it. My name's Jenny Barker and I'm the Chief of Party for the Seafood Alliance for Legality and Traceability, or SALT. We had more than 150 people register for this webinar from around the world. We have over 50 participants now, so we're really excited to have this important conversation. While we are getting started, please go ahead and put your name and affiliation in the chat box if that's something you're interested in doing, so you can connect with colleagues. And when you do that, be sure to click the drop-down arrow that includes sharing that information with all panelists and all attendees. And so as I look at the results, about half of you have voted. You still have a little bit more time. It's looking like, though, about 76% of people are talking about their traceability journey as bumpy, but making progress, which means we are all in the same boat as to why we're here today, because it's a really important journey, but it's not an easy journey. And then it looks like from the results, we have return on investment is still a really big question and a challenge for people looking to adopt traceability, access to affordable technology, and then that interoperability questions. How do different systems speak to each other in order to get the information you need across supply chains? So, to get started today, I just wanted to quickly go over the agenda. Why are we going to, sort of talk about this at all? And then we'll go to some exciting panelists that we have to speak with you today. I'm in Washington, D.C., but we have presenters in lots of different places. And we have 4 really accomplished women that I'm happy to have. We'll answer questions at the end, but do feel free to pose those in the Q&A section, which it looks like someone has already done. Jonty put information there. You can also put that in the chat. So we'll answer those questions at the end. And then we are going to leave the webinar open for additional questions a while after. We, in the spirit of lessons learned, have realized we should probably schedule extra time, because there's always really rich conversation and questions. So still, please stay as long as you can, and feel free to email us at saltatfishwise.org if you have additional questions. Just quickly, I wanted to speak to what SALT is. The Seafood Alliance for Legality and Traceability is a 5-year public-private partnership between USAID and the Walton Family, Packard, and Moore Foundations, and is implemented by Fishwise. We're a nonprofit organization. We're just finishing our 3rd year of implementation. On this slide, you can see our 4 objectives, and the reason that SALT is interested in hosting traceability traps and triumphs is because we're focused on global knowledge exchange and learning to build electronic seafood systems that address social, economic, and ecological well-being. And SALT really sprung from the idea that fostering those fruitful and honest conversations between industry, government, and civil society will really encourage us to learn from one another. And honestly, we've heard from the very beginning from different stakeholders in the design of SALT that they really wanted to talk about the challenging issues. So why discuss the hard stuff? Starting something new or piloting an idea will always include challenges, and to keep those instances manageable or infrequent, we need to discuss where others have encountered problems, which we're calling traps, and how they overcame them, the triumphs. These conversations ensure that everyone doesn't have to encounter the same problems over and over, and it helps the seafood community get closer to the global solutions we seek when it comes to combating illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. So there are a lot of words we think about when we think about barriers or obstacles. Some may have negative connotations, but our approach is to look at it from the value that those experiences bring as an opportunity really for us to learn as a community. So getting things right the first time is hard. When you're dealing with a complex global supply chain like this graphic depicts, with different people involved at each step, it's even more complicated. And so you can see through this graphic that SALT has sort of amended from a product that USAID Oceans created, that there are many opportunities for challenges to arise within such a complex seafood supply chain. People make errors, technology is hard, rules are different at different places. And so this is really an important complex issue to tackle. And the more complex the issue, the more learnings from challenges are really essential. And so the best way we can do that, we think, is by learning from each other. So today we're going to hear from panelists that we asked to answer really these 3 questions. What's your experience? What traps did you fall into during your traceability journey? And how did you triumph over those struggles? Oops. All right. So we really have the good fortune to work with all of these women on SALT, whether it's through our advisory committee or sponsorship or the principals consultative committee. They have a wealth of knowledge to share, and we're really thankful that they're here today and willing to share their experience and challenges with us. Sorry, these clicks. We'll start with Teresa. Teresa manages the grants in the environmental program that leverage the power of supply chain to advocate for more sustainable fisheries at Walton Family Foundation. Prior to that, she worked with EDF, and in full disclosure, she is a co-founder of Fishwise. Momo is coming to us from Ireland today and brings a wealth of experience from field implementation of fisheries projects in Southeast Asia. She's done a lot of work in Indonesia and now works with Chile and Peru, so we're really happy to have her expertise today. Celeste recently launched the Virgil group in 2020 after 11 years in the federal government, working with the White House Council on Environmental Quality and NOAA, primarily focused on the establishment, design, and launch of the Seafood Import Monitoring Program, or SIM. So we're happy to have her here today. And then finally, Cecilia is coming to us from Mexico, where she's the executive director of the nonprofit organization SmartFish. And she's a member of the technical advisory committee that was convened by CONAPESCO, which is Mexico's Fishery Administration, to draft regulations for a national seafood traceability system. Excuse me. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Teresa to share her screen and her presentation and thoughts with us today. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks, Jenny. I'm so happy to be here. It's just been great fun to see SALT grow and develop over time. You know, one of the things we didn't test was actually me advancing my slides. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Okay, great. So I wanted to start off with a little bit about the Walton Family Foundation's theory of change that we've been working under for the last 5 years. And the idea is that we work with buyers to make sustainable seafood commitments. This creates an incentive for producers to change their practices and help seafood products then meet these sustainability commitments, all verified through things like certification as well as traceability. But I think what's really become clear over the last 5 years is that traceability does not just sit in this verification bucket, and there are components of the entire system that are critical to making traceability work. So over the past 5 years, as well as really the work that we had done before this recent strategy, both within the foundation as well as in the sustainable seafood community and the fisheries community overall, we have built up some of these traps over time. And I think we're to the point now where we can actually speak to how we've overcome them. I will say when we talk about traps, I think it's very easy to stay there. So I encourage you all to challenge me during the questions if it doesn't feel like I provided a satisfactory pathway to overcome some of those. So some of the things that I've seen us do in the foundation, again, with partners over time, really come in sort of 3 different varieties. The first is being unclear about what we're trying to achieve and looking to solutions that are maybe not fit for purpose of the problem. We often get really excited about certain technologies without thinking about the landscape that they sit in and the overall market. And so we really kind of jump to the solution and put the cart before the horse. And then finally, I think we get very enamored by technology and lose the underlying purpose of what we're trying to achieve through a traceability program. So we just recently completed an evaluation of our global seafood markets work with the foundation, or with the Packard Foundation, who's a partner in SALT. And one of the things that really struck me in their takeaway around transparency and traceability is that there is a lack of consistent understanding about traceability, transparency, catch documentation systems, electronic monitoring and reporting, and how they link all together, or if they need to at all. And this is across a these findings come across a very wide range of stakeholders, government officials, seafood industry groups, and NGOs. And there was a significant mismatch, both in terms of what was needed as well as progress being made on traceability. And I think that comes from the fact that we haven't really sought out to define how these systems fit together. When we talk about electronic monitoring, how does that play into transparency? What's the need for transparency in systems like the Global Fishing Watch? And how does traceability and verification fit into that? And then overall, how do you incentivize people using these different systems and getting the systems to talk to one another? I think this is something that in particular I'm quite guilty of myself. I think it's quite normal to look for a very elegant solution. If electronic monitoring just flowed into the public domain for transparency and you could verify it all through traceability, it would be great and everyone would have what they needed. But in reality, there are different purposes and different goals. And I think this is one of the huge values of SALT, to think about each of these different electronic systems, how they fit together and where they can reinforce each other and where they just need to be different things. And I think that's okay to recognize as well. I think the other trap that then that need for an elegant solution often creates is to jump into trialing technology before it's really clear what we're trying to get out of it. And I think this is perhaps something that donors are most guilty of. The common vision for that the Conservation Alliance for Seafood Solutions wrote nearly a decade ago wasn't clear in defining why traceability was necessary or what it looked like. And so that led to us really having a challenge with adoption. And so when we jumped to technology solutions, we hadn't yet built up the marketplace and demand for traceability. We couldn't justify why an investment in this technology was necessary for this time. And so, and we didn't build the infrastructure around it. So the data going into traceability systems was often garbage. It couldn't move upstream or downstream because the systems couldn't talk to each other. And we jumped right into donors paying NGOs to deploy systems. And when that money went away, the system stopped being used because the enabling conditions around it weren't developed. And I think we still struggle with this because it's not a linear issue. We both need to we need to be working on all of these things simultaneously, but it's important that we work on them across the board, or we risk repeating pilots that don't go anywhere and not designing pilots for the intended scale in the end. We're making progress on this front. I think the release of the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability, their KDEs and their protocols, has been hugely important in starting to build that enabling system that then will allow all of these pilots to go to scale. And finally, I think potentially the most dangerous, particularly for philanthropy, because our dollars can be quite disruptive to a market, is the heavy focus on specific tech solutions or tech generally. I think it was really exciting for us to see innovative ideas and technology companies wanting to come into this space. But I also think that that focus on tech hampered the market from developing and us addressing those issues around ROI that I just spoke to. We dwelled for a long time on what the technological barriers were, when in reality, if we had a good system with good data and demand, a paper system would have been sufficient. It would have been highly inefficient and certainly ripe for fraud, but at the time we couldn't even justify people using paper systems. And so I think the barrier here that we learned was really people and political will and not the technology itself. And I think we're in a great place now because really we can point that out. We can now say technology is not the problem. The problem is adoption. And so we can move and step back from this focus on we don't have a solution for that, to saying, how do we use the solutions we have? How do we adapt those technological solutions and just get people to start using traceability and electronic catch documentation and monitoring? And so I actually smile every time someone kind of rolls their eyes at a new firm coming up, because it feels not that they aren't important to the system, but I think there's an increasing recognition that we need to get those enabling conditions so that those companies, those tech companies, can thrive. And so we don't have so many false starts with really great ideas and great companies coming out, but no market to support them. And so I think there is an increased interest in really building up that demand and building the case. And I see a lot of the work on the import control rules around the world helping to incentivize that, as well as an increased focus on using transparency and technology and traceability to combat things like illegal fishing and human rights abuses at sea. So I think it's still easy to fall into those traps that I've named, but I also think people are starting to find their way out of it. And it is early days, and I think platforms like SALT in particular are extremely helpful in helping us get over those repeated traps to find the path forward and start to really address the people part of growing the use of traceability and increasing the quality and value of traceability. So thank you, and I am really excited to see where this continues to go.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Teresa, for your honesty and your candor. That is excellent. It looks like that we have lost who is supposed to be our next speaker. I wonder if Celeste, I may ask you to jump in and go next with the hopes that Momo can join us back. I think she's having internet issues. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks, Jenny, for the introduction. This is really exciting. It's my first opportunity to speak after having joined the advisory committee for SALT. So it's very fun for us. I talked about, or sorry, Jenny talked a little bit about my background, but I'm really bringing the federal perspective to this, specifically the US regulatory perspective. I spent most of the last 6 years in government working on the launch of the Seafood Import Monitoring Program, which, for those who might not be familiar with it, is a US regulatory program that requires that importers report information as product moves through customs and then retain full supply chain records from the point of harvest up to that point of entry through customs. I'm still working on these issues in the private sector now. There's a little bit of information on the slide, but the way I decided to structure this was to talk you through some of the traps and triumphs I experienced in the establishment, launch, and then striving for long-term success of traceability programs. So moving along. All right, if you're establishing a traceability program, one of the things you need to be cognizant of is that you're not trying to require more of a foreign government or a foreign entity than you require domestically. This concept is called national treatment, and it is the basis of arguments for barriers to trade. This type of issue can be raised at the World Trade Organization, and the issue of national treatment alone was what stopped the implementation of shrimp and abalone for the Seafood Import Monitoring Program until NOAA was directed by Congress to add it in. Political constraints. So when you're establishing a traceability program, politics is always going to be a factor. It might be the timing. Maybe you need to get it done in a certain amount of time. Maybe there's certain agencies that do or do not want to be involved. Maybe your budget is limited. But it's good to be mindful of those constraints and try to work productively within them rather than change them, especially if you're already in government. The last point of traps is related to a list I always kept in my office that I called annoying names for traceability, like bait to plate, boat to throat, I don't know, fish to dish. And the reason that always bothered me was because it glosses over the problems of jurisdiction. It's so important to think about the fact that no single agency or government is able to completely resolve regulatory issues with traceability. And it's good if you're talking to the government to be mindful of what they're capable of doing and then suggest collaborative actions maybe that they could be doing with other agencies or other governments to advance your initiatives. So some of the things that I thought that went well in my time in government was public engagement. So the US requires quite a lot of public input and regulatory process, but we went well above and beyond that. I think that was quite helpful and would encourage it for others. Another is cooperation within governments. So you can't really combat illegal fishing with just one agency because there are different authorities, different capabilities, and managing that as a government and continuing to do that even up to the present time has been extremely helpful. Another one is bipartisan support. So I think we did a nice job when I was in government of making sure to keep messaging that was supportive of both liberal and conservative views on the benefits of IUU fishing always front of mind. And we didn't solely focus on IUU as being a conservation program or solely focus on it being a leveling the playing field issue, which I think has allowed it to be successful in both of the last two administrations. So, launching compliance. Okay, so one of the early hurdles that I experienced in launch of the Seafood Import Monitoring Program was explaining that certification is not the same thing as compliance. Having a certification that your product is sustainable or responsible or fair trade is not a traceability record in itself. They had to come up with the actual documentation of traceability, and that can be burdensome. And I think sometimes people assume that the certification meant compliance with federal law, which in this case, it did not mean that. Another very important point related to this is consistency of audits. If you're going to set up a program like Teresa mentioned that is paper-based, which most of the Seafood Import Monitoring Program is, you really need to have consistency of review and not have like one person who's going to find all of the errors and another person who's going to give everyone a pass. It's the consistency of review has to be impeccable to make a program like this launch effectively. Another is the issue of languages. Foreign languages is one thing, but actually speaking between different sectors. So explaining fisheries concepts to customs brokers. I think we did a very good job of explaining fisheries concepts to the trade industry, because that was the main focus of our efforts to try to make sure there were no disruptions to trade. What we didn't do as well, I think, is explain trade terminology to fisheries people. And it led to a fair amount of confusion, I think, in the public sector about what we meant, what was mandatory, what was optional. And it's something to keep in mind for the future for anyone else who's working on a traceability program. You really have to translate the jargon both ways. Some of the things we did well. So SIMP had one huge advantage in its setup, which is that we were able to leverage the US Customs and Border Protection single window for entry filing. We were able to add specific data elements that we wanted to be reported electronically at the time of entry into commerce, and then be able to review that in near real time. I cannot stress how important data collection is for something like this, and it's been a huge benefit, I think, to this program in my experience. I also think that NOAA did a good job of engaging industry. Not to say that industry was over the moon about this regulation, they weren't, but to say that we didn't surprise people with the regulation. We tried to make sure that everyone had every opportunity to comply. And like I said before, that we didn't do such a bad job with outreach that we ended up disrupting trade. And we didn't. So I think that that's a good sign that things worked. I would also say implementation guides. And by that, I generally mean written outreach materials. Try to put as much as you can online so that anyone can view it, because it's really hard to reach, to Jenny's diagram early on, everybody involved in a supply chain that might be interested in what you're doing or what you're requiring. So try to put as much online as you can. All right, next slide. Okay, so I would say that the Seafood Import Monitoring Program right now, in my opinion, is kind of between that launch and long-term success space. I mentioned, and this really speaks to, I think, Teresa's point, I call it fan fiction, but there is a real lack of ground truthing of what is really needed by industry. It can also be called reality checks, but trying to make sure that you ground truth the idea, you find a market fit, you understand what the real capability gaps are before sort of moving forward with an action plan or an advocacy plan is going to be extremely helpful and really important to not go down these unhelpful rabbit holes in the future. And we all have to be mindful of the resources available to address this issue. And I'd like to see more reality checking and less fan fiction. Another point is that personally, I think that if an agency or if the government is going to collect a lot of data beyond the bare minimum requirements of maybe the regulation you're running, there is an expectation that you're going to do a little bit more with that. And I would like to see, governments and others that have big traceability programs, maybe you can't have full transparency of the actual data, but you could at least provide insights from the data that could be helpful to other people that want to comply, that want to better understand the market for academic purposes, et cetera. So I'd like to see more data utilization. And then another point here is unseen enforcement. So if industry doesn't see their hard work paying off and they don't see bad actors punished, I think that there's an incentive drop in the desire to perform at your highest level. And having visible enforcement is really key to that. Some of the things that I think are going well, so I guess this is a little bit of self-promotion, but we are working on software that will assess the risk of IUU seafood and traceability in supply chains. I think this is something that is missing right now. And I'm excited that we were selected for the Ocean Startup Challenge, which is a global blue tech initiative. We're in the finalists and we'll find out this week if we won the whole thing. Another thing I'm excited about is SIMP has a compliant importers list that I think is coming, like it will be actually finalized in the next month or so. But that program should be able to identify publicly importers who have done a good job in their compliance with the Seafood Import Monitoring Program. It has a lot of potential, but really requires other people to look at that, to celebrate good actors and make the most of the opportunity. The last I wanted to point out is that it really is important to get your hands dirty with this if we want to have long-term success. I, like Teresa, want to shout out the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability. I think that they've done a really good job of just trying to dig into a very, very messy issue, which is like integration of data and terminology. And I hope that more organizations will be willing to sort of go into that level of detail. Lastly, so if any of what I brought up resonates with you and we don't have a chance to get to it today, my email address is up here. And if you really want to get into it, we're hiring. We're looking to fill a contractor position with NOAA's Office of International Affairs and Seafood Inspection that will work on SIMP and the Marine Mammal Protection Act imports rule. So you can learn more about that on our website. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Celeste. Some really important points. And luckily we were able to get Momo back. So I'm happy to have you share your screen and also welcome Cecilia to the panel. She'll be sharing her thoughts next, but Momo, I'll turn it over to you.
Beautiful, thank you. Sorry about that little disappearing act. I am back. All right, well, thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here today, and thanks very much to the SALT team for having me speak today. Like we mentioned, there's a couple of questions that I was asked to talk about. So first of all, to really go into like what is my experience with traceability. I have worked mainly with small scale fisheries, which means that the traceability work that I've been doing has also been really focused on that small scale sector. So yeah, just a little history of that work. I worked on a couple of research and development projects that were really focused on traceability, identifying the merits of traceability and the implementation of data creating technologies within supply chains at different nodes of artisanal tuna fisheries. So both projects, while implementing traceability and data systems, were interested in traceability for the sake of traceability, but also for the ability of that data collected to support other aspects, right? So things like management, adherence to regulation, compliance to increasing international requirements for export level products. More recently, working with Future Fish and working with TNC on the ground in Belize, we worked on the implementation of a traceability system within a lobster co-op processing plant. So again, my role there was a little bit like it is today, I guess, to highlight the traps and to make sure that the implementation process encountered as few obstacles as possible. Jenny mentioned at Future Fish, we're working predominantly in Chile and Peru now. So in Chile, we're just on the cusp of a pilot where we're going to be working with Abelobi from South Africa, and we'll be implementing two components of their apps, so the Fisher and the Marketplace app. And the idea there is to support the artisanal hake fishers in Chile to electronically collate their data, to support their submission of data to the government, and then also to innovate around how they get their product to the market. In Peru, we haven't dug in deeply on traceability implementation, and that really has something to do with the fact that we've done some feasibility assessments, and the story in Peru is that while there are traceability implementations in certain species, there really is an initial focus is needed on formalization. So really a really strong focus on registration of a really expansive fleet kind of needs to be a precursor to the implementation of traceability. So yeah, before I go into the traps, I did want to note I think it's important to put traceability into context. So I think traceability means something different to a lot of people. To me, because I've always worked in NGOs and supported industry in the implementation process, I really think that it's a tool. It facilitates data collection. It stores, transfers data throughout the supply chain. And if required, there's data reporting and transparency aspects to it. I often hear of it kind of rolled out as a solution for sustainability, which I really think it is not. It can support sustainability, but it's not a solution. And yeah, it's something as well that you hear a lot when you speak about traceability, but just the point of the matter is it really depends on the quality of the data that goes into the system. So if you put rubbish in, you also get rubbish out. So I think that's a really important thing to note. All right, onto the traps. Yeah, so lack of industry and supply chain buy-in, half-hearted interest in traceability is not enough as a starting point for a project. I think traceability is complicated when you're working with supply chains, small-scale fisheries, and you really need to put an effort into making the supply chain understand what the project is about, what traceability is about, the cost, the time investment, the reasons why we're doing a traceability implementation, and really what the end result aims to be. And there has to be an incentive, right? If you're working with artisanal fishers, there has to be an incentive. So spend time making sure that there's enough of a market push, an efficiency gain, or some other advantage to the traceability before you start implementing. Or you have to be aware that there probably won't be full adoption or acceptance. It's kind of the nature of fishers, of industry, that they need to get something out of the effort. Next trap, remember where your expertise lies. This is something that really resonates with me. Are you a technology, software, hardware, legal, or partnership expert? Do you have secret powers that overcome barriers to time zones? And I'm really referring to a lot of work we would have done in Indonesia. We were implementing a traceability system in a processing plant on the ground with an international partner who would have been doing the implementation of the technology. So while at MDPI, which is where I worked at the time, we had really amazing expertise on our team, traceability, HACCP, knew all about SIMP, all of the rules, but we didn't have programming, software, or hardware expertise on our team. So we didn't understand the legal aspects of implementing or building a new system. So you really get boiled down into the details of okay, well, who owns this data? The data ownership, how secure is the data? All of these things are things that you don't necessarily think about it as you embark on a project. And it can really suck the time from a project and also the money. So I think that's something really important to think about. Hardware is another important thing. We were implementing in Indonesia. It's really important to think about where you're going to get your hardware from. Is it going to be locally sourced, regionally sourced? And just think about the fact that as you're importing hardware, there's going to be tax and import implications, things get caught up in customs, and that might miss 6 months of a timeline for your project. So just really like think about those things. Number 3 on the traps, inconsistency and lack of continuity. So you have to give a project time to mature, and you have to stick with it even if the adoption and the enthusiasm is not immediately obvious. Industry partners especially kind of shift to the path of least resistance. And if implementing the traceability is hard and the benefits aren't immediately obvious, they might shift away. So stick with it and make sure you work on really showing those benefits to your partners on the ground. Yeah, so now for a couple of triumphs. Yeah, so a co-design system with inbuilt incentives create the basis for adoption and success. This anecdote really is about like working with middlemen in Indonesia. And if you think about middlemen in small scale fisheries, in developing world contexts, you often have informality, like middlemen are not submitting, are not necessarily submitting data to government. So there's very little drive for them to be involved in technology and data collection. So you really need to build with that in mind. And you also need to build in mind that, you know, like what's going to motivate them to use this app. So we ended up designing and building an application which does exactly what these middlemen would be doing on a regular daily basis, but manually. So building like basically an accounting system for them where they document what they buy, what they source, from whom, and whom they sell to. And this app would then be able to give them a report back and be able to tell them, you know, where they are on a monthly basis. Maybe print out receipts, invoices for one up and one down the supply chain. So just really important that you're building for the user and that there's an incentive or an efficiency gain for them. So something that actually makes them really want to be involved. Multidisciplinary teams are really important. It depends on the scale of your traceability project, whether it's solely implementation of an existing system, or if you're really building something new or research and development. So the more diverse your team is, the more you're going to know about all these traps, right? People from industry, from government, from academia, they're going to all have different understandings of different concepts of traceability. So it's a good way of just mitigating the traps from the very beginning. I think you have to use your team as well to communicate your achievements, to research the market possibilities, to understand the government requirements. And basically, by having this holistic approach, you're going to have the widest possibility of success. Yeah, and the last one, this one is really important. So industry buy-in. Traceability, again, as I said earlier, it's a supply chain tool. And it's really like if you gain success and standing in the wider context, it needs to meet the demands, right? So it needs to meet the demands and the requirements of industry. It should make their processes more efficient, their ability to engage markets and report to government easier, and it might even create cost-saving changes in the process of buying, selling, or storing, or processing fish. Industry will adopt a system if it makes sense to them. So make sure they're engaged, that they see the merit, and that they understand the functionality of the system. Because to be honest, if they're on board, then you probably will have a successful project. Thanks very much.
Awesome, thank you, Momo. Great and important points that you shared. I'll just give a quick reminder, go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A, and I'll turn to our final speaker, Cecilia, Blasco, and then we'll get to questions after that. So welcome.
Hello, everyone. First, I'd like to thank Hannah and Jenny and the team at SALT for the invitation to participate in this Traps and Triumphs series. I really like learning from others' traceability experience so we can apply them to our work at SmartFish. Hannah and Jenny asked that I share the work on developing seafood traceability regulations in Mexico. So I'll jump right in, and I'm happy to take questions at the end. Towards the end of December last year, CONAPESCA, which is the federal agency responsible for fisheries management in Mexico, convened a technical working group to draft a standard known as a norma for seafood traceability in Mexico. And I was invited to the working group because of SmartFish's experience implementing traceability systems in the small scale fisheries where we work. So this working group includes colleagues from other NGOs, representatives from the private sector, including software companies and an aquaculture company, public officials from CONAPESCA, from INAPESCA, which is the Fisheries Research Institute, and from SENASICA, which is the federal agency responsible for agricultural food safety. And as is custom now for communicating public policy initiative, this was posted on Twitter, which you see here on the screen. So I'm not at liberty to disclose the details of the work the group does until the draft standard is open for public comment, but I'll try to share aspects that I think might be useful for others working on similar initiatives. So why did CONAPESCA convene this working group and why the interest in traceability now? My read is that this was in response to pressure from producers, both small scale and industrial fleets, to address illegal fishing, which they feel is hurting their businesses. Also, companies exporting to the United States need to be able to prove that their products do not come from the Upper Gulf region, which is under a ban on imports to the United States because of the problem with the vaquita, which is this endangered porpoise. Also from companies who need to comply with traceability rules to export both to the United States and to the European Union, and due to pressure from NGOs and consumers that demanding transparency and an end to seafood substitutions. Oceana has documented some pretty egregious cases of substitution which have been in the press recently. To give context on the type of regulation the group is drafting, a norma or a standard is a mandatory technical regulation which establishes the rules for a process, service, or production method. And to develop such a standard, the federal agency in question, in this case CONAPESCA, must convene a technical committee to draft the standard, which then goes through a public review process and a process to make a cost-benefit analysis process. The standard cannot mandate obligations which go beyond existing laws. Changes to laws or new laws have to go through Congress and the legislative process. So when we began working, these were some of the areas of concern. The first was what on earth do we mean by traceability, and how do we even begin to build a national system to track seafood from the fisher or the harvester to the final consumer? And for the we felt that for the standard to be accepted and operational, it could not generate costs or extra paperwork for producers, especially for small scale fishers. And for the standard to even pass the review process, it cannot create more costs either to users or to public finances than the existing system. So at some point, CONAPESCA needs to prepare a cost-benefit analysis of the standard to prove that this is the case. And there was also some discussion on whether to create a new system or an exclusive system for seafood, or to integrate seafood into a general system for tracking agriculture that tracks cows, for example. And the group decided that seafood needed its own system. Some of the triumphs so far. I think the working group has been has had very productive discussions, and it's a very, there's a strong interest in moving this forward. We have been convening remotely since March, which ironically has helped since participants don't need to travel to Mazatlan and everyone is stuck at home. So more than happy to participate in meetings online. The guidance and the standards published by the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability in March, just as this effort was beginning, have been really, really useful for beginning to understand what we mean by traceability and how you can build a system. It has given us terminology and a framework to work around. And also a North Star. This is the global standard, then we need to be aligned with this global standard. There's a consensus that the Mexican traceability system needs to have two goals. On the one hand, to enable supply chain actors to be able to verify the legality of seafood, and also to improve food safety. There's also consensus that the system should include the value chain from harvest to final sale, although this is a big challenge. And lastly, another positive aspect is that the existing catch reporting and harvest reporting system provides a pretty good foundation to start with. So if we take this diagram of the third-party repository architecture proposed by the GCSD and apply it to the existing system in Mexico, we see that the current catch, landing, and farm harvest reports that producers are already mandated to present to the government cover all the key data elements recommended in the standard. And the system has been increasingly moving online, especially during the pandemic. So it's also pretty digitalized, and users are having to learn how to submit information online. Where we start to run into some challenges is in the subsequent critical tracking events after landing or harvest. So the processing and some of the distribution further on down the line. So if we take a list of all the critical tracking events from the GDSD documents and then map them onto the agencies that oversee these events, we start to see where the challenge is. Here are the agency names in English. So one major difficulty is the large number of agencies involved across 4 different ministries. So far, the agencies that have been involved in the working group are those in orange. So within the Agriculture Ministry, both Conapesca, the fisheries, and Senacica, the agriculture food safety. The other ministries or the other agencies have been convened in some cases, but haven't attended meetings or haven't even been convened. Seafood traceability is probably not high on their priority list of some of these agencies, especially the economy ministry or the finance and public credit ministry that have a lot on their plate at this moment. Here also we see why including food safety as part of the goals of the traceability system is important, because it brings into the norm the agency responsible for processing, which is where some of the information or data further down the supply chain comes in. So to wrap up, the triumphs so far are the recognition, I think, of the importance of a traceability system and this strong interest in creating a system by convening this multi-stakeholder technical working group, that the group is convening regularly and has reached agreement on key points and is moving forward. I also think that the alignment with the GTSD standards has been really important, and a commitment to a bait-to-play system has also been important. Which brings me to the challenges. I don't want to call them traps because I think this is an ongoing effort and they're not yet traps. But the main challenge is that the agencies that we need to reach the end of the supply chain are not yet participating in the group. And it's unclear how users will report the data associated with these critical tracking events to the system. And then looking further ahead, there will also be a technical challenge of building a system that can handle all the necessary data and then give back to users the information they need. So I'll wrap it up here, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much to all of the panelists for such a rich and diverse set of information that you shared, from the experience with small scale fishers working around the world, from donor perspective, how SIMP came to be in the ins and outs, and then looking at how you create such a system in Mexico. It's been a really great conversation, and I'm thankful to have all of your expertise. I was looking at some of the questions, and thanks for those who have already answered some of the questions in the Q&A section. There are a couple that I think might be interesting for our panelists to speak about for a little bit. There's one question from Jose around the difficulty in getting small and middle-sized companies to buy into such a process. And so have we seen, or have you managed to convince people who may be resistant to join or be part of some of these conversations? And then just a second one, and before I open it up, is, are there success stories in using traceability to detect IUU, and was there enforcement action taken? So feel free, panelists, to unmute yourselves and share if you have any responses.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on Jose's question. I think obviously there's the regulatory requirements which are a driver. So when the SIMP rule came out, these things are definitely drivers. I think there needs to be some translation of those regulatory requirements down to these small to medium businesses in order for them to be able to, understand and take a simple path towards implementation. I also think then, similar to different sustainability initiatives, that the pressure from the supply chain. So if you have buyers who have a set standard of traceability that they're pushing down the supply chain, that is a good way to get smaller and medium businesses engaged. And then I think there's also just by engaging and speaking about innovation, traceability can save you money, right? If you have an efficient system put into your processing plant, for example, you can see which table of your processing plant has better like basically work, and that they're getting a better return from like a fish or more steaks out of a loin or whatever. So you can see minute details if you have a good traceability system. So I think it's about you need to create the incentives for these companies to engage and show them just what the process and the return on investment can be. It's not easy by any means, but I think you have to zone in to kind of the needs and requirements of individual companies.
Yeah, I think just to build on that and also get on to the garbage in, garbage out piece. Every node in the supply chain, from the fisher all the way through to the end consumer, is going to have a different incentive for traceability to want to see it in place, or to continue to fight it, right? And so it really does require a bit of bespoke engagement for each node, but keeping in mind what the whole system looks like. And I think that's why part of it has been so challenging. And I think where we are right now with salt is trying to reconcile those needs across the supply chain. The value that a fisher gets from having an electronic system of either verification or their own practices on the water are going to be really different than the value that a retailer gets from having a good traceability system. And I think figuring out how to try to not do this in a one-shot way where everyone has everything they need, but also recognizing that we need efficiency in the system, requires a community, as Momo pointed out, of people with really broad experiences in each of those different nodes. We can build something that makes sense for the different users and isn't fighting their own self-interest. And I think that's been where some of the challenges we've had with supply chain engagement in the past is it's felt like it's been something that's been imposed on them rather than something that is for their own benefit, and finding that different story that you tell to each node in the supply chain about why this provides value for them. It feels like a have to do instead of a want to do.
Excellent. Any other thoughts on the success stories in using traceability to detect IUU, and if there was enforcement, or the idea about good practices and verification?
So just a note on here, I think this kind of speaks to the point of being able to produce visible enforcement actions as a result of traceability programs. There's a reason why it's hard to answer this question. Yes, I think is this information being used to detect IUU fishing? Of course, if it's going somewhere and somebody's reviewing it. But the fact that I can't say, yeah, this, and this all happened because of SIMP data coming into the US government, I just think shows that we really do need to have visible enforcement.
Which is the other side of saying everyone's got to have a bespoke solution. But if you're not thinking about how, for example, Global Fishing Watch data is actionable for either the supply chain or the government, and it's not built into those checks in the system because you haven't integrated them all in together, it also doesn't go anywhere. So there's a fine line that we're trying to walk there between allowing bespoke solutions, but also making sure that they feed in to a broader system.
Yeah, Teresa, I can't tell you how many pitches I've heard over the years of tech companies, seeking government's thoughts or, ideally approval for what they're doing. And I would always ask them, well, how are you integrating this into the requirements that they have to do for reporting? And I can't readily think of an example of anyone who said that they were doing that. I'm sure probably somebody was, but it is not a priority for these bespoke solutions.
Cecilia, you've gotten a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I would love to hear from you just if you have any thoughts about both any of those questions we've talked about or the specific questions about your work in Mexico.
Sure. Looking at one of the questions about the burden that, or the technology that companies will need to comply with a traceability system. So the working group has been very cognizant of the cost of implementing, and what the system that we're trying to build does is put a lot of that cost onto the government. So we can't require anything that isn't already required. What we can do is make sure that the information that users, that producers, that processors are supplying is actually used in an effective way, and that buyers down the supply chain can consult that information to see whether at least what they plan to purchase was produced legally. That's where all the garbage in, garbage out comes out. A lot of product is legalized, quote unquote, when it's entered into the system. So a system that can start to detect those cases will probably help with the IEU. Although I don't know that the system will have a list of here's your illegal seafood, go get them. But I think it will help, especially buyers down towards the end of the supply chain. The supermarket chain at the moment has absolutely no way of verifying whether what they're buying was legally caught. So that, in answer to that question. And then in answering to the incentives on the different parts of the supply chain, there is a strong demand from producers at the moment to address IEU because they feel like it's hurting them. Especially exporters feel like a lot of the vaquita ban and complying with SIMP is making the bad actors are making it hard for them to do business. So they would like a system that helps detect those bad actors and maybe keep them out of the market. So that's kind of where the demand for a system like this is coming in.
Great, thank you. Just quickly before we go to more questions, I'm mindful that some people may have to leave at the hour. We will continue this conversation and answering questions for a bit longer, but I just wanted to share some next steps and another huge thank you to our excellent panelists who were really instrumental and have been really providing us a really broad perspective on traceability issues around the globe. We want to keep this conversation going through the Thought Exchange survey. We originally sent it out with the email invitation and would like to continue that. So I'm going to put that in the chat for you quickly so you can add your contributions and some more questions there. We will answer every single question that was done that was offered during the meeting today, even if we don't get to it now. So please know that we will be giving it to all of you. We'll be answering your questions directly. After this, you can share the recordings. You can also reach out to SALT if you have specific questions or the challenges that you're trying to encounter. We can either connect you potentially with some of the panelists here today. We can connect you with other resources. And we really just want to make sure that we're serving individual specific needs. And just quickly to reference a series that we did on this, it's a 5-part series we did about some of the challenges and barriers to implementing electronic traceability, and it really just complements many of the things that we heard today. And so I'll ask you to visit that. And so I want to go back at this point and just thank everyone and thank my SALT colleague Hannah for all of her work on this, and then go ahead and get back to some of the questions that we had. And for those of you who have to drop off, please just keep in touch with us. So Justin had a few questions around designing systems that allow information to move through the supply chain efficiently, but also to sort of understand that that data isn't static. You may have to correct it. And then it looks like somebody else already answered his other question. Any thoughts from the panelists on that point about system design? I will just say we at SALT are looking at establishing principles around the design of systems to make it beneficial, not just for regulatory compliance, but for identifying ways you could share the data for better environmental management, and seeing what risks you may be able to identify with traceability data that can reduce human rights abuses in supply chains. But I'll defer also to the panelists who may have ideas on that design question. Okay, the principles are where you're going.
No, I think Justin makes it's a really good question. It's a problem that we encounter implementing traceability. You know, when the user inputs the wrong number of zeros, for example, and then you have an error that carries through the entire system, and being able to go into it and correct these kind of errors is really important. It's going to be a big challenge. You know, it's one thing to do it on a bespoke traceability system for your small group of producers. It's going to be a much larger challenge to do it on a national level for this centralized system that's managing data from all the fisheries. So I think that's where AI maybe can help. And these are things that are really beyond my level of expertise, but I hope that we can find some technical solutions to this data challenge, and how do you take out of the system data that is probably incorrect, and how do you flag it?
Yeah, just to add to Cecilia's point, in some ways, a data set that you have to move through a supply chain is the ideal scenario. But realistically, we're still dealing with a largely paper-based trail for traceability. And one of the things that I'm focused on, I think is important, is trying to do a better job of detecting fraud in records. What can we do through AI machine learning to start dealing with the reality of paper records of traceability?
Yeah, just to add to Celeste's point that I think she rightly made around the challenges of paper-based traceability in the system, and both for verification, but also just for cost of maintenance. I think there are a ton of flaws of paper-based traceability systems. That being said, we haven't even gotten them adopted broadly in the supply chain. And so I think while we're still trying to build this up, obviously helping people leapfrog from skipping over paper-based completely into electronic is great, but it gets back to that political will issue where we don't yet have the will for people to just track things on paper. And so I think really focusing on those underlying reasons why this isn't broadly adopted. And Justin, how you get people to do that, I am increasingly a believer in thinking about how we better align the supply chains for our values. So it's, how are we making decisions about who we support and which suppliers can meet those traceability requirements, and frankly, helping the individual fishers comply. I don't believe traceability should be a price premium thing, because a premium implies that it's not scaled and that it is a small portion of the market. However, we also need to make sure that we are reflecting the true value of the data that comes through the system in our supply chain and in the choices every node of supply chain makes while they're purchasing. So I think each different node has a responsibility for creating those incentives to jump to an electronic system where feasible. But even just forcing a paper-based system in the places where it's not right now because of capacity or financial limitations, like, let's start there, because that is still missing in a huge swath of our global seafood supply chain.
Great, thank you. I'm going to have two more questions before I close us out. The first one is from Sally. Our panelists may be able to see in the Q&A. How many market countries or the percentage of global markets do you think we need in the system to make it effective to combat IUU globally? And is a system that includes all species versus a select set of species make it easier for markets and exporters to implement? The other question, or that was two, but I want to also include Roxanne's question, which is the question of aquaculture versus wild capture fisheries, or inshore versus offshore fisheries. There are different supply chains. Is there a universal benchmark to cover every possibility within the industry?
I think a quick and relatively simple, my initial response to Roxanne's question around just the complexity of these different supply chains is the global dialogue on seafood traceability is trialing their KDEs and their systems and protocols across all of those different types of fisheries, seafood suppliers, including aquaculture. And I think when we get into like the feed sources and components into aquaculture, there are some interesting places to look in the deforestation community where they're really concerned about soy production in rainforests going into beef. And it's something that they're struggling with too when you go that deep into component ingredients that people, that are difficult to track, but there are models there that we can look to.
And I don't have a good answer for how many countries is enough countries to make a difference in the market and how many species is enough species. But I would say going after the countries that have the highest volume of exports and imports and the countries that are really economically dependent on seafood trade, it's the most highly traded food commodity on earth. It's something that basically every country has some role in. Either they're actively fishing, they're a secondary processor, they're re-importing and re-exporting product. I think it would be good to focus not only on the countries that are the largest buyers, but also countries that are large sellers and large producers. I also think it could be worth focusing a little bit more on RFMOs and those management structures and see if that might be a venue to advocate for traceability. And as for all versus some species, that's a question that in the development of the seafood import monitoring program we struggled with. And I've heard mixed things, in hindsight. Once you hit a certain amount of species, it almost becomes more of a pain to include some, but not all. So while I don't necessarily think that immediately requiring traceability for all species is a good idea, doing some sort of lower level case study, trial, and then doing a broader expansion on sort of a second run makes a lot of sense to me. You can also continue to sort of gradually scale up over time, but I just think at some point you're hitting a point where you're working so hard to re-roll out the same program that it's just diminishing returns.
I've spent the last 3 weeks having to dig into international seafood trade data, and it is atrocious, like completely unusable if you want to understand. There are these broad categories around finfish not elsewhere identified. And so I think one of the huge risks without requiring full traceability across all species is that you recategorize what you're exporting and you change it into finfish NEI. And I don't know what this is, so therefore we don't need to include it in the system. And I think even without expanding SIMP to all species, we could look at how these trade codes are labeled. And super boring, wonky work, but it does matter in helping to understand what is actually going on. I'm curious as to whether or not programs like SIMP have led to a shift in what's coming in as SIMP identified species in the trade codes to what has shifted to finfish NEI, right, which is undifferentiated. And are we seeing changes that might indicate that somehow people are just reclassifying what they're trading in order to avoid the information? We've seen it happen with tariffs for other products. So it seems like it would be one way to get around the system. And so, you know, I definitely hear the diminishing returns over time, but I think we also have some like gaping loopholes that we need to figure out how to address one way or another. It may not be through SIMP, it may be through tightening down the trade codes, but there are certainly gaping loopholes.
Yeah, and for people who are unfamiliar, basically every product in trade has to go through trade codes. It's called the Harmonized Trade Schedule, HTS, and everything has one. The US has a few more like identifying numbers and more specificity, but it's still super, super vague. And there are a ton of harmonized tariff schedule codes that are for seafood that are not covered under SIMP, for example, because it just says unspecified fish, right? Or unspecified seafood. That was a really difficult justification to say, oh yeah, that code definitely needs to be included in this program that is for certain species. And that could be a functional enhancement of the program to either expand to these more generic HTS codes and also to look more carefully at the species codes, right? So beyond the tariff schedule, there's a 3-letter code associated with every like scientifically named species, and that's part of the required data for SIMP. So maybe expanding that and making that required for all seafood could be sort of a lower level expansion to at least get that data flowing.
Great. Thank you so much for all of the participants who've stayed on, which half of the people did. We'll now leave it to my panelists. Any final comments? And I'll just say a huge thank you again for such a rich conversation. And as I said, we'll keep it going on Thought Exchange. We'll also make sure we're answering specifically and sharing out the answers with the recording